Hello, BlizzCon! Thank you all for coming. It's so wonderful to see so many people here today. You are proof that the written word is alive and well. Give yourselves a round of applause. Welcome to Building Worlds, inside Blizzard Publishing, where we're going to give you a behind-the-scenes look at how writers translate Blizzard games into unforgettable novels, comic books, short stories, and other forms of prose. My name is Kate Gary. I am the senior editor for Blizzard Publishing, and here we're going to bring out your panel. First, we have Christy Golden, a familiar face to many of you. Next, Mickey Nielsen, Matt Burns, Robert Brooks, Greg Weisman, and Timothy Zahn. All right, we're going to start with Christy, New York Times best-selling author, here today to talk to us about re-releases of two of her classic Warcraft novels, Lord of the Clans and Rise of the Horde. Now, Christy, you originally wrote these 10 and 15 years ago, and a lot has happened since then. World of Warcraft has released its 6th expansion. There was a little movie called Warcraft, which incidentally featured one of the characters you created in Rise of the Horde, Draka. How did it feel to see her on the big screen?
It was amazing. It was absolutely amazing. I actually had my first glimpse here at BlizzCon when you treated everybody to snippets of the movie before it came out. And I knew she was going to be in the movie, but I didn't know that I would see her. So I'm sitting here with everybody else, and then she's on screen, and I went, ah! I literally shrieked, and it was pretty amazing and very gratifying to see how she was treated and see her, something that you created and gave life to, and a name and a personality on the screen.
I'm a fan. I was excited to see her too. But now it's 2016. Your novels are being re-released, and the audience for Warcraft books has grown astronomically, to put it mildly. What do you think in these stories will resonate with audiences today?
Well, the nice thing about both of these books is they take place before World of Warcraft even existed. So these are real historical stories, 2001 and I believe 2006. So they're not impinging on anything that's going on now, anything that's going. This is the setup, and this is going back to the roots. This is going back to where we see Thrall as a baby picking up right at the end of the movie. We see baby Thrall, and we see him grow up, who becomes such a pivotal character in World of Warcraft. And then we get to see the literal rise of the Horde and how that all began in the game setting as opposed to the movie setting. So we have a chance to go even deeper into it. And I think that people will enjoy revisiting this and kind of brushing up on their roots.
Fantastic. All right, now, the story of how you wrote Lord of the Clans is the stuff of Blizzard legend. Tell us what happened there.
Oh, this is totally epic. I was just coming off not working with another gaming company who shall remain nameless. It was a very bad experience, and I was a little bruised from it. And an editor over at Pocket Books, with whom I had worked doing my Star Trek novels, contacted me and said, this company, Blizzard, has a game that they never finished, that they chose not to produce, but they want the story turned into a novel. Is that something you'd be interested in? And I'm like, oh, I don't know, gaming companies, I don't know. I had a good friend of mine, though, who was familiar with Blizzard games. And he said, Christy, Blizzard really cares about what they do. They do quality work. They're known for it. They have a great deal of passion. I think you'd like working with them. So I said, well, all right. Well, little did I know that on the other end of this, Chris Metzen was talking to this editor and saying, oh, Star Trek writer. I don't know. I don't think a Star Trek writer could really be able to do justice to orcs. The mighty orc horde. I'm just not sure. And she said, Christy really knows her stuff. She's very passionate about what she do. I think you'll like working with her. So like a matchmaker almost. And sure enough, in 6 weeks, I worked with Chris and produced Rise of the Lord of the Clans. Really loved it, really loved the world. Chris was excited about it, and the rest is history. And there's a fun footnote that you may not know, which is that editor is Jen Heddle, who is now licensing over at Star Wars. So it's a very small world.
All right, thank you very much, Christy. Now we move to Mickey Nielsen, my old boss and New York Times best-selling author.
I've got my eye on you.
Taught me everything I know. You're here to talk about comic books, in particular, the upcoming StarCraft II comic, Nova the Keep, which will be released later this month. Yeah. I read it. I loved it.
Did you like it?
I did.
I think you might have edited that as well.
I did. The editing was impeccable, especially. But
I noticed that. Yeah.
It's a great story, and I noticed it has a very strong theme about secrets and what it means to keep them. How did you come up with that?
Yeah, so we were sitting around talking, and we were trying to figure out what the next evolution of Nova's character was going to be after all that she's been through. And we talked about the fact that with the Dominion right now, with Valerian, it used to be that if you were a ghost, you had to have your mind wiped after every mission. Well, now with Valerian, it's a choice. And so we really started to focus on that and trying to figure out, okay, if Nova now has the choice to remember some of the things that she's done, and because she's an assassin, sometimes she does things that maybe she wouldn't be so proud of. What if she has a choice to remember those things or not? What kind of a choice is she going to make? And so our story started to revolve around secrets. And then we started thinking about Valerian as well. And Valerian became a kind of mirror for Nova because Valerian has some secrets of his own that we're going to explore in the comic.
All right. Now we're going to change gears just a little bit and talk about motion books. A lot of you may know that Blizzard has recently partnered with Madefire to release our comic books with limited sound, light, and movement as motion books. And Mickey, I'm going to show an example from a comic you wrote, Overwatch Torbjorn Destroyer.
Yeah.
Big deal is
Awesome.
right. So actually, Nova the Keep will be released as a motion book also. But Mickey, you've written several traditional comics for us in the past. How does writing for motion books affect your process?
So I write visually anyway. I mean, I'm always, when I'm writing, whether it's a book or a comic or whatever it is, I'm seeing it in my head, kind of as a movie anyway. So with the motion comic, I do give it a little bit more thought, and I'll tell you, with Madefire, I've seen the Nova comic, and there's one in particular, one page that I'll talk about where Nova is floating in 0G, and you can take the mouse and you can move not only Nova floating there, but the debris that's in front and around her. And so it's like this whole parallax effect that looks really, really good. And the other motion that they did in the comic is fantastic. I think about things like that when I'm writing the scene where, there's spaceships and things like that, and maybe you can see the spaceships moving, and the sound is impeccable. The whole thing turned out fantastic. Madefire did a really, really good job with this.
All right, thank you very much, Mickey. Now we move to Blizzard staff writers, Matt Burns and Robert Brooks, who also work 10 feet away from me. Here to talk to us about World of Warcraft Chronicle, a history of the story of Warcraft told over several volumes. You have fans here. Now, Volume 1 was released earlier this year. rave reviews, flew off the shelves, New York Times bestsellers list. So Volume 2, which is scheduled to come out next year, is about as highly anticipated as anything we've ever worked on. No pressure.
No pressure.
So Volume 2 will be the definitive history for how the orcs built the Dark Portal to Azeroth, the formation of the Alliance, and the First and Second Wars. How do you decide what makes it into the history and what gets left behind? This is a question for both of you.
Oh man, that's tough. We've had to make some really difficult decisions. Just recently, actually, we probably made the hardest choice we've ever made, and we decided to leave out this epic, millennia-spanning backstory of Hogger. So that's very difficult. But you know, no. But honestly, there's so much story to draw on, from the games to the books to the comics, that we really have to take everything on a case-by-case basis and ask ourselves if the characters and events we're talking about, if they have a big enough impact on the overall story to tell them. We really want Chronicle to be something you can go through to get a general overview of the history. You can think of it as a spiritual successor to the old game manuals. So sometimes we use those as a meter to gauge how deep to dive into the subjects that we're writing about.
Yeah, and then one of the things that we were really focusing on is finding the events that had major ripple effects across the entire Warcraft mythology. Something like as big as the Titans taking out the old gods. It had both good and bad points to it. Didn't all go according to plan, and those effects, the ripple effects and the consequences, have been felt all across Azeroth for a long, long time, and you get to point out where those things connect. That helped us focus on what was important.
All right, good answers. I'm sure no one will be angry at anything you leave out. All right, Matt, let's dig a bit more into what's going to be in Volume 2. That's going to start at the very beginning of Draenor, its ancient peoples, and the role that the Titans played in its earliest days. Tell us the process for writing that lore.
Well, for Draenor, we had a few goals. The first was we wanted to start from the beginning, the earliest age of history. And we also wanted that to feel very different from Azeroth. So one example of that I can give is about elementals. On Azeroth, the elementals are very chaotic and aggressive. On Draenor, we decided to make them very passive and subdued. Another goal was really digging out the unknowns of Draenor's past. Stuff like the Apexis Arakoa, the ancient orc clans, and the ancient ogre empire. These were things that people knew a little bit about, but we hadn't really explored in depth yet, so we wanted to do that. So those goals really informed our writing process, as did all of the lore released with the Warlords of Draenor expansion and a lot of the books we'd previously published. We basically used those sources and we worked backward, filling out the empty areas of history. It was kind of the opposite of how we wrote Volume 1, but I think it worked out really well for Volume 2. We also have some art here today. So this is a piece of art from Chronicle Volume 2, and it's done by the very talented artist Abe Taraki. And if you remember from Warlords of Draenor, there were two factions called the Primals and the Breakers. Well, these two characters are basically the progenitors of those two factions. These guys are huge. They're like as big as mountains. The rocky character is named Grond, and the plant character is named Botan. So long, long ago, they waged this war for control of Draenor that would really establish the different races, cultures, and ecosystems that we saw in the game. So that's a little hint of what to expect in Volume 2.
I can't wait to read it. Thank you, Mr. Burns. Actually, I have read it. I edited it. That's why you were giving me shade.
Yep.
Now we're going to move to Mr. Brooks. I'm going to dig a bit more into Volume 1, specifically Ancient Kalimdor. How much of that history was new lore, and how much was a matter of tying together existing threads?
Most of it was just saying clearly what had already been either hinted at or implied or talked about in-game and in our extended fiction. We just needed to connect all the dots, make sure it felt clean and that everything, there were no big gaps in between story moments. A couple times we actually did find a gap that just, it felt like the story wasn't it wasn't connecting as well as we really kind of hoped it would. So we would go back to the drawing board and pitch to the game team how it might have gone down, since we hadn't actually said in the past what explicitly had happened. I think the big one was up on, I think I have a slide here, Mr. Lei Shen from Pandaria. Particularly how he died in our mythology, because you guys playing Miss Pandaria, you know he was resurrected by the Zandalari trolls, but we had never explicitly said how he had died. There had been talk internally on the game teams that probably he had died of old age after failing to reverse the curse of flesh, but we hadn't explicitly said it, and it didn't really account for anything, like why it took so long for the Zandalari trolls to try to resurrect him. But so when we looked at the book and we saw it just wasn't fitting as well as we wanted to, we ended up pitching to the game team something a little bit different. Maybe Lei Shen, being the Thunder King, being the owner of Titan power on Azeroth, decided that all Titan artifacts and creations also belonged to him. So maybe he went to his next door neighbors, the Tol'vir in Uldum, and said, hey guys, I own everything in this place now because, you know, I deserve it. And they told him to go to hell. Not a great thing to tell a Thunder King to go to hell, so he leaves, but he comes back with his giant army of Mogu and his Zandalari buddies to basically do a death march straight in Uldum and take it anyways. In the Tol'vir, they knew they couldn't win this war, so rather than fighting an actual battle, they just turned on the origination device, which nuked pretty much all of the land in the area, including Lei Shen and his armies and the Zandalari leadership, throwing both of those empires into disarray and leaving the land barren. Which when you walk in there in Cataclysm is what you end up seeing. And that was a little bit more dramatic, and it was a little bit more fun, and the game team ended up liking it, so it wrapped up a whole bunch of things, and yeah, that was one of the examples of something new that we came up with for the book.
Thank you very much, Robert. Now we come to a critically acclaimed novelist, Emmy-nominated animation writer, Greg Weisman. He has his fans. Give it up. You might remember him from Disney's Gargoyles and Star Wars Rebels, among other little projects. And now he's here to talk to us about World of Warcraft Traveler, Blizzard's new action-adventure book series, primarily targeted at kids age 8 through 12, but it's really a wonderful read for people of all ages, with illustrations by Samwise Didier. Some people might know him from Blizzard art. Now, Greg, when you first came to us, we already had a fairly fleshed out roadmap for the characters and storylines we wanted Traveler to explore. But a lot of what's in book one is pure Greg Weisman. Tell us what you brought and what inspired you.
It was a lot of fun just absorbing all the material, and there was a lot to absorb because there's a lot of lore in World of Warcraft. Yeah, Blizzard had a pretty clear idea about the lead character, Aram, but as I went through the materials, I felt that the book was sort of very male, very masculine. Most of the characters were male. All the significant characters were male. It wasn't a very diverse universe that didn't seem to fit the Azeroth that I was seeing online. And so one of the things I wanted to do was create a second lead, a character named Mikasa Flintwill, who was A, female, and B, of color. And for the crew of Wavestrider, which is the ship that they're both sailing on, there are other species on there, but among the humans, I wanted to make sure that that was a diverse group of individuals as well. So a lot of what I was doing was trying to sort of, on the one hand, create a more general diversity, but also with specificity, just create more individuals in the book as opposed to types, because that also seemed like an important theme to the book, that Aram sort of is very naive and he enters this world assuming a lot of things about species and people, and one of the main lessons he learns throughout the first book is just not to do that, and to realize that everyone's an individual and that everyone's more connected than he thought. Now, Aram is a sketch artist, and he carries a sketchbook with him everywhere he goes, and so all this art that Samwise did for us is really in the book. You don't see Sammy's signature on it. You see Aram's signature down in the corner there, because those are all, in theory, his sketches. And what Aram found by drawing all these different species, whether they were gnolls or ogres or night elves or whatever, was that, you know, there's a basic musculature that we all have in common, and in drawing these creatures and species that felt alien to him, by drawing them he connected with them, and that to me was a sort of an important element, that he began to see what everyone had in common as opposed to what was separating them, and that really changes who he is in the book.
That is one of the great lessons in the book, and about how family is the people you find over time. I really love that.
Well, we talk a lot in the book about everyone sort of has at least two families in their lives. There's the ones they grow up with, and then the one they sort of form, whether it's, you know, wife and kids, or you know, the crew of Wave Strider or whatever. Family is a flowing concept and not a stagnant one.
All right, now speaking of family, Greg, you had a unique challenge because you had to take World of Warcraft, which is a game that was conceived for teen and older audiences, mature themes, violence, and you had to translate it for younger readers, age 8 through 12. Did you encounter any difficulties with that?
Not a lot. I mean, my background mostly is in animation, and when we write a cartoon like Gargoyles or Young Justice or Star Wars Rebels, we want to make sure that we've got plenty of fun stuff for the younger audience, but we write it on layers, so there's stuff there for an older viewer in the case of the cartoons, or in the case of this book, for older readers to appreciate as well. Stuff that isn't going to leave the younger readers out, but which they'll sort of glide by because it doesn't register for them, but which an older reader will sort of get and hook on to. Look, ultimately, I say this all the time, I write for myself. That's all I know how to do. Because I need to be passionate about the work, because my assumption is that if I'm not passionate about it, how can I expect any reader at all to ever be passionate about it? And so I don't write down to kids. I don't believe in doing that. I never did that in the cartoons I've done. Right now, I work for a preschool show called Shimmer and Shine. It's for, you know, 2 to 4-year-olds, basically, and I still try not to write down to the audience at all. I just think it's really important that we respect kids and we respect their intelligence and their ability to interpret things. I mean, there was a little bit of violence that we toned down, not in terms of what happens, but just in terms of the way it's described on the page.
There were a few decapitations, as I remember.
We still have decapitations in this book, but they're described in a reader-friendly way. Kid-friendly decapitations, and there's one actually that I love in there that I fought for a little bit because I think it's kind of hilarious. It's a really funny decapitation. So, you know, I do think the book is great for ages 7 to 107. If you hit 108, you're way out of the age range, but otherwise, I really think it's a book for all ages. It's not just for kids. And even for kids younger than 7, it's a great book to read aloud. When my kids were younger, I read the Harry Potter books aloud to them and all sorts of other books, and to me that's a great way to connect with your kids, is reading aloud to them. And it's amazing what they can handle when they're reading with their parents.
All right, thank you very much, Greg. Now we come to New York Times best-selling author and Hugo Award winner, Timothy Zahn. You might know him from his Star Wars novels. Also has his fans. He's here today to talk to us about his new novel, StarCraft Evolution, which you can buy for the very first time here at BlizzCon. Hint, hint. Now, Tim, this is the first novel to come after the conclusion of the main StarCraft 2 storyline. So other than the story in Nova Covert Ops, the world was wide open for you to play around with.
Yeah.
How did you come up with the story for Evolution?
I think actually it comes after Nova as well, just Nova isn't all out yet. It was a joint effort. Mid-November last year, I was invited down here to talk to the Blizzard people. I spent an hour, hour and a half, something like that, talking with the lore people, trying to get a better feel for StarCraft than I had already. And then sat down with the various story people. The first idea they pitched was, we'd like to do something with a planet that has suddenly revitalized from a burned out cinder to full of life and full of plant life and all of that again. And then we spent about 2 hours batting the idea around, working out the outline, working out the details, doing what I call, other people call consequence testing. Okay, if this is what we're doing, what are the consequences? And are those what we want in the book, or are those what we're going to lead to dead ends or contradictions or something else? So we spent about 2 hours doing that, and then for various reasons, that was a Monday, I couldn't fly back home till Thursday, so I went back to the hotel. Tuesday, I wrote out 2,000 or 3,000 word outline, sent it back to Blizzard, I think 4:30 on Tuesday. We had another meeting set for Wednesday just in case we needed to talk about other things. By that time, everybody had read the outline. We did a few little tweaks to it. Okay, we'd like this instead of that. Okay, no problem, that'll change this. Okay, it'll work. Went back to, flew back home, had a new outline redone by, I think, Friday. And middle of the following week, we went off on a 3-week signing tour of Brazil. So fortunately, it took them a little while to approve the outline, but by mid-Brazil, I was able to start writing it. And we had an end of February deadline, wound up being about a week early, just before we left for London.
All right. Now, Evolution features several iconic, well-known characters from the game. Valerian, Mengsk, Zagara, Abathur, Artanis, Mad Horner. So these are characters that the fans know and love already, and you had to take them and make them recognizable, but also give them your own signature. What was your process for that?
Well, just to make it clear, Mad Horner is mentioned, but he's apparently gone, is what I was told. So, but who knows? Like many places, people gone doesn't mean they can't come back someday. It's always tricky to write somebody else's characters, especially from a different medium. In StarCraft, the game, you get to see what Valerian says and what he does, but you don't get into his mind. You don't have that internal monologue of this is what he's thinking, this is how he's working through the logic or whatever. So it was a matter of looking at their history, Valerians and the others, looking at the history, looking at the current situation. We're at peace, but we're still hurting. How are people going to be behaving? How are they going to react to each other? Valerian is now emperor. He's got a lot of responsibilities. How do you balance those with, okay, we want peace, that's the only, a war would be devastating, but we can't afford to be blindsided either, so how do we balance this? How do we figure out what's going on? The book is, along with the combat sort of thing from StarCraft, it's also a puzzle story. Okay, this is the situation. How did it get here? Who's responsible? Is somebody playing us? Is somebody who's being honest? Who's being conniving, etc.? Fortunately, because of the storyline, instead of having to focus all of my attention on the iconic characters, I got to create 6 new ones that would be a large amount of the focus of the story, a large amount of the action and such. Actually, the most difficult part was looking through the StarCraft manuals and seeing, okay, there are like 30 different weapons the Terrans have, 50 different type of Zerg, Protoss are all over the map. I can't put all of these in here or we're going to lose readers who aren't familiar with the game. And that was one of the things we agreed on right at the beginning, is we wanted StarCraft players to enjoy the book, but we also wanted it to be an entry point for people who didn't have much knowledge or experience with the game. They can still pick it up. We've got enough background layered in to make it understandable. So I crunched everything down to a few types of each, a few types of Zerg, a few types of weaponry, etc., and kind of the simplified version. This is what we're going to deal with. So hopefully people have been coming up to me saying, do you have to know everything about StarCraft? And you shouldn't have to.
And you did a really fantastic job.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Tim. That concludes the individual questions I have for the panelists. Now I'm going to ask them some general questions that anyone can answer. Feel free to chime in. My first question, it's kind of a personal one for me, because I know several of you have written for other universes, Star Trek and Star Wars among them. So I want to know how writing for those worlds compares with writing for Blizzard. And be gentle.
I'll take that. I sat down and I figured out that I've written for 13 different franchises as of this year. And one of the remarkable things about Blizzard is there's always so much heart, and there's this great passion for what you do and a desire to really connect with the writers. I'm not saying the others don't have that, but it's just very much in the forefront here. And there's also a lot of times things go one way from the franchise to the writer, and that's fine and that's logical. But Blizzard seems a little more willing than most to receive as well as give ideas. So that's a great joy for me as a writer to almost co-write with an IP.
Thank you, Christy. Tim?
Yeah, you hear a lot of horror stories about authors working with different franchises. I've never had that problem. Every group I've worked with has been wonderful to work with. Blizzard was no exception. When I needed some help, they were there. When characters weren't quite right, they would show me how to tweak them correct. So yeah, it's been a wonderful experience, and Blizzard's just been marvelous.
Thank you very much. Anything to add, Greg?
No, I mean, they pretty much covered it. I've worked with Marvel and DC and Lucasfilm, and at minimum, probably others too. But yeah, there's a lot of back and forth with Blizzard, and that's great. There's a lot of ability to sort of go, I mean, I'm sending an email saying, what do Yeti eat? And that gets answered within 24 hours.
What color is orc blood?
I mean, and that's great. You just have, all these resources, and it's really useful, and it's terrific.
Yeah, shout out to our lore team. They work overtime on answering these questions. I'm going to ask one more general question of the panel, and then I'm going to open the floor to audience questions. So start thinking about what you want to ask the members of our panel, and you can start lining up to the Blizzard crew by the microphones over there. Now this question, I know it's a favorite one for writers, because I think it's safe to say that you have what many people in the audience would consider a dream job. So what advice do you have to people who want to break into the writing business? Don't all answer at once. My
first advice is always to write, and it sounds so obvious, but I can't tell you how many people come up to me who are really interested in being writers, and I'm like, well, how much have you written? Well, I've got all these ideas. I'm like, great. Have you written any of them down? I've got notes on I'm like, have you written any of it? Well, not yet. And I'm like, well, then you're not yet a writer. And so my advice to writers is to write. I mean, I've got a lot of other advice too, to read a lot, to proofread a lot.
Yes.
But first and foremost, write. And don't worry about whether it's good or not. Seriously, just get in the habit of writing literally every single day. I don't care how tired you are coming home from work. Give yourself at least a half hour where you force yourself to write, because if you're a professional writer, you've got to work through all those things to make deadlines anyway. You know, I had a guy come up to me at a convention I was at recently, a very passionate guy, and he had written something. He had written a comic book, which was great. And I said, well, how long is it? He said 16 pages. And they had self-published it, and that was great. But I'm like, well, but these days a professional comic book is 20 pages. How long did it take you to write the script? He's like, well, about 6 months. And I'm like, well, I got to tell you, 6 months for 16 pages is way too long. So you need to be writing every day so that you can, among other things, just learn to get more quantity out. And I'm a quality guy, I appreciate that, but if you can't get the quantity going, then you're not going to make it as a professional writer.
So kind of to piggyback on that, we live, as writers, we live in a great time right now where you have a lot of opportunities, especially online. You can go to these websites like Wattpad and Inkit and different places where you can put stories up there, and if you're updating your story every week, it really does force you to do exactly that, to make sure that you are writing, because you know that you have to put that post up in 1 week, and you know that people are going to be reading that and they're going to give feedback to you. And that's the other thing, psychologically, as a writer, you want to get that feedback, and so these websites allow you to get that feedback immediately, which is great. It's great for you to kind of boost your spirit and boost your confidence.
I would add that in addition to what Greg said, which is sit down and write, anything you can do to help make it a habit and get it fixed in your head. You said commit half an hour a day. I would say pick the same place and the same time every day. And a little trick that I learned a while ago, it's kind of fun. The sense of smell is processed in the same part of the brain as long-term memory. So if you have a scent that you like a candle or essential oil or whatever it is, and you have that scent going when you write, all of these things that you start doing regularly are going to get your brain into gear faster. Your brain is going to be, oh, I'm sitting here at this time, I'm smelling this, it's time to write. And you're going to drop in a lot faster and make the most of that half hour.
Well, that's great practical advice, Christy. Any other tips from our writers on the panel?
The only thing I would say is definitely write every day. That's perfect advice. You have to do that, but don't put the pressure on yourself that what you're writing is going to be perfect and it's going to make your career like today. Like, that's not really realistic. I would just put something down and work it out. Like, see how it goes. Just try something. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't work, you leave it. No one else has to see it. But when you keep doing that, you just get stronger as a writer. You learn what works and what doesn't, just for you, even if no one else, and you will get better over time.
People talk to me a lot about writing for cartoons or writing for television. I'm like, write a script, then put it in a drawer. Don't look at it for 3 months. Write a second script, write a third script. After you've written the third script, go back and look at the first one. You're going to look at it, you're going to read it and think it sucks. So rewrite it, make it better, then put it in a drawer again, then take out the second script and rewrite that. Start a fourth one, start a fifth one. The problem that I see a lot of writers, even artists also run into, is they want that first thing to be perfect. And until that first thing is perfect, they can't move on. And it just doesn't work that way. I mean, I suppose it's like theoretically possible that it might, but for most of us who do this professionally, we have to do a lot of rewriting, and it means, particularly when you're starting out, put things aside. Don't immerse yourself in it for 3 or 4 months. Let time pass. Look at it again with fresh eyes, and you may be able to fix things that you couldn't solve before, or notice things that are broken that you didn't realize were broken before. And still, it's about writing. And proofread. Please, God, proofread.
All right, are we ready for some audience questions? Oh, we have the lights, camera, action. First question.
Hello, my name is Timothy Vasconcelos, and I've been a Blizzard fan since about 6 years old. My dad over there got me playing from a very early age, and I see that Blizzard as a company is moving towards that direction to get people to incorporate their children, make this a multi-generational experience. As writers, you really define what worlds these children and like families are walking through together. And I wonder what content you produce that creates that same experience as a game for the children, that they can not only be read to with their parents, but also be played with, as I did with my father. And if you see any new platforms, content, different types of games that we don't even see Blizzard have today.
Is that a specific question for someone on the panel, or?
I came in late, so I don't know very many of your names, but if anybody has it open, I'd be glad to hear what you have.
Multi-generational storytelling. I think we see that with Traveler for sure.
Yeah, I think what Greg said about layering things so that the children, teens, and adults can all enjoy it, though as a child who reads it 20 years later will get something different out of it. They'll see all the other stuff that they missed the first time. So I think for me it's a matter of, you write a story, if you're writing a battle, that the reader can visualize what's happening and later perhaps go back to the game and, oh, I see how this all worked. So, but mostly it's the layering thing, I think.
And I'd say using universal themes as well, themes that are going to resonate with all the different demographics.
I mean, that was a lot of the impetus behind doing Traveler in the first place, that so many of our players grew up playing Blizzard games and now they have families of their own. So that was a very good question. Thank you. Are we ready for the next one?
So this is for the guys on Chronicle. I've been playing Warcraft for over 10 years now, and seeing all of the lore that's been kind of linked together in Chronicle is huge for me. But there's one race that's really lacking, and I think you guys, I don't know if you have guys plans to explore it, but Taurens. I love Taurens so much, and there's just not enough written lore about them, and there's so much that's still kind of unknown. Are there any plans to kind of explore that more?
Well, I can say specifically for Chronicle, I can say that in one of the next books, you know, we're going to talk about the Tauren a lot and how they related to Thrall and the orcs in Warcraft 3. So we'll be talking about their culture a little bit and what they were like before you see them in World of Warcraft. You know, some of the struggles that they went through before they met Thrall and the New Horde.
Yeah, especially their war with the Centaur. We delve into that a little bit more because, you know, there was a good raid and dungeon and stuff like that. But yeah, we dig into it more in a future volume.
All right, thank you very much. Ready for our next question.
Hi there. So actually a little bit in the veins of the previous question. Personally, I adore all the lore that's being put into the Chronicle books. Thank you so much. But there's something a little bit with what Christy Golden actually went into just a little bit with one of her books. We haven't necessarily seen the world of Argus and the ancient Draenei culture before they were the Draenei. Is there any plans to look into that into the future, or in some written or some other form?
I would be surprised if we didn't. We don't have a specific plan right now, but that's only because our plans for the volumes of Chronicle that we have planned out right now don't yet jump into Legion content, which is where you would really start to see us delving into that stuff. Yeah, like Chronicle Volume 2 starts at Ancient Draenor, and it basically ends with the destruction of Draenor when it becomes Outland. So the end of Warcraft 2, the expansion, then Beyond the Dark Portal. So that's sort of the scope of Volume 2, and Volume 3 doesn't quite catch up to Legion. So, but if we go further than that, and we don't know if we will, but if we do, that would certainly be something we would address.
Oh, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Brian. You guys talked a lot about the back and forth between authors and Blizzard, the company, in the creative process, and I was wondering, for the individual novels you guys have written or the works that you guys have done, how much comes in terms of initiative from the company, and how much comes from the author pitching the plot, stuff like that?
Well, in my case, Blizzard had the idea for Traveler in the first place, and the idea for the character of Aram, and they sought out, but they sought out pitches on it. So I was one of, I think, well, one of more than one. I don't know how many other people pitched, but I wasn't the only one. And I submitted an outline based on the materials that Blizzard gave me, and they liked what I wrote, and we went from there.
Usually by necessity, because it's based on the game, Blizzard knows where the games are going, and so they'll be a few steps ahead, and so they'll have a pretty good idea of what the story content is that they're going to be looking for within the next year, year and a half, and so Blizzard will typically put together the outlines and ideas and then seek out authors and get their feedback.
And it depends on the stage of development, too. I've worked with books that I had a 30-page outline that was very detailed, and then other books where they had an idea like, we want to put Garrosh Hellscream on trial, and then we all just kind of got together and hammered it out together. So I think it depends on the needs of the project.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Ready for our next question.
Hello, my name's Paige Barstad. I'm actually a creative writing student at ASU, and I'm graduating in May. And you guys really do have like the ideal dream job that all of us always dream of. And more than just write every day, what is your advice for someone like me who's just about to go into the field? Like, where do I start? Like, what is the advice that you guys wish you had when you went into this field?
I was a cautionary tale, and the number one thing I would tell people in don't be like Christy with this. I had a full-length novel that I shopped around for 7 years, and I got the good rejection letters, the ones that were Dear Christy, not Dear Author, and like that. And they all said the same thing: this isn't right for us, but send us your next. I'm looking at you, Greg. And I thought this was the bee's knees, so I didn't write a next. And fortunately, I got in through a side door, which is another story, but I really wish I had heeded that advice and kept writing and kept doing other things, because there's a term for it, and it's called a trunk novel. And it's called a trunk novel because that's where you cut your teeth on your work, and it really just needs to stay in a trunk. It shouldn't be published. And I have one, and I think a lot of authors do. So my suggestion to you, the first thing would be, first go to writerbeware.org, which is sponsored by Science Fiction Writers of America. Tons of helpful information there, very practical information. And secondly, just keep going and keep going and keep going, and realize that your first baby may not be the one that gets to see the world.
Thank you guys so much.
All right, thank you. Next question.
Hi, this is mostly for Mr. Weissman and Mr. Zahn. As you've written in both the Star Wars and the Warcraft universe, or Blizzard universes, do you feel constrained by the universe and what's expected of the novels by the companies?
We're constrained in the same way a basketball player is constrained by the size of the court, the number of people, the periods, etc. It leaves a lot of room for maneuvering. So there's always, I mean, for me, it might have been a little constraining if I had to deal with characters that were already well established. But I got to do both. I got to do the established characters, Emperor Valerian and such, but also create my own characters that I could weave into the StarCraft universe. So I don't feel any particular constraint except this is the universe, this is the tech, these are the aliens. Find a good story to tell about them.
Yeah, I mean, writing Star Wars Rebels, we just really wanted to try and capture the feel that it attracted us to Star Wars when we were kids. You know, when I was 12 years old and the first Star Wars movie came out and I stood in line to see it, I wanted to get that feeling into the books, not the books, the cartoon show, but, you know, and the difference for me, for Blizzard, for me personally, is that I wasn't immersed in Blizzard ahead of time. I immersed myself when I got the job, not before the fact, whereas on Star Wars, I was already a huge fan, but the thing is everything's relative. So like, I come into Star Wars Rebels feeling like, well, I'm a huge Star Wars fan, and then I meet some of the people at Lucasfilm that I'm working with, and I know nothing. Nothing. But fortunately, they knew everything. So it's like you were saying, I mean, yeah, there are always going to be borderlines and rules and things like that, but you're just trying to make the best version of whatever franchise you're working in that you possibly can. And since in general that's what the franchise holders want too, it tends to work out pretty well.
Yeah, the goal is to write a good story, and you can do that in any universe.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. We have time for just a couple more questions.
My name is Nick, and I'm from the Moonguard server. My question is for Christy, Matt, and Robert. First of all, I just want to say I'm a big fan of the lore, the Warcraft story. Sometimes gaps in the lore lead to speculation from fans, and oftentimes these gaps are filled in with conjecture from quests, NPC dialogue, comics, game manuals, etc. Sometimes these secondary sources are retconned, contradict each other, or changed for gameplay reasons. Outside of literature such as the Chronicles, what would you say to fans trying to fill in the gaps to these lore and answer some of these questions?
That's a good question. I really like that question. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, outside of Chronicle, something that we have worked on in the past and, you know, we'll continue working on in the future is just, you know, things on the website. You know, a lot of times there's a bio for a character on the website, or there's a write-up about a zone. Some stuff like that can also fill in some of those gaps sometimes.
I recommend index cards. Yeah. It's an in-joke, sorry.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
All right. So this is to all the writers on the board. You've been working with Blizzard, creating all these different stories, putting more characters in that never existed in the first place. You've created your own original characters that might have their own minor roles, might have really major roles. Like Christy, you actually got one of your characters into the movie, so that's pretty cool. How does it feel knowing you've created all these characters that people might love, might hate to love, might love to hate? How does it feel?
It's a real honor. One of the great things about Blizzard when you play in their sandbox is they're very generous. And they'll often take something that you've done and put it in the game or reference it or something like that. Like I said, it works both ways with Blizzard very often. So I think it's really flattering and it's a real honor, especially when I get emails from people telling me how they like that specific character so much. And I feel very lucky to be in a position where I can do that.
Thank you. Keep up the good work, guys.
Thanks. Thank you. We do have time to sneak in one more question if it's a quick one.
Hi, my name is Matthew Clements. I'm a novelist, screenwriter, game designer. I've worked in the traditional pen and paper RPG industry. And I've worked with franchises that have been around for a long time, and I've started from scratch. And I'm wondering, how important do you think it is to build your own worlds before you can play with someone else's toys in their sandbox?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend that. So I remember a young guy who came into Blizzard, and he had his sketches of his D&D characters. His name was Chris Metzen. And he brought in all his sketches and laid them out and started talking about the D&D worlds that he had been building and everything else. And there are plenty of people on the WoW team who got onto that team because of RPG worlds that they had built. And the world building that they had done for that was so impressive that it really helped them to get the job on the team. So absolutely.
As far as writing novels for something like Star Wars, they don't accept just general submissions. It's an invitation only. And to be invited, you need to prove you can come up with good ideas, you can write coherent stories, and you can deliver them on time, which is very important. So the more you can create of your own, the more track record you can build up of your own material, the easier it's going to be to come to Blizzard or whoever and say, I'd like to do this for you.
All right.
All right, thank you very much. That's all we have time for. So let's give it up for our panelists one more time. Christy Golden, Mickey Nielsen, Matt Burns, Robert Brooks, Greg Weissman, and Timothy Zahn. So I invite you all to come up and meet the authors. You can buy copies of their books, Lord of the Clans, Rise of the Horde, StarCraft Evolution, and World of Warcraft Traveler on the 3rd floor. Meet the authors, ask them some more questions, get their signature, starting at 2:15. So that's the 3rd floor, author signing area, 2:15 to 3:30. Thank you very much and have a great BlizzCon.